I'm actually an amateur MMA fighter. I started competing in MMA in April 2009, but I've been studying martial arts for about 4 years. If you saw the program, you'll see that I was slated to talk about women's MMA, specifically whether we have a place in the cage and whether or not we should be fighting. I thought about it and ultimately decided I didn't want to take that feminist of an approach. I really wanted to touch on some of the misconceptions that are out there with MMA, with my sport of women's MMA, and it just so happens that a lot of those misconceptions apply to just MMA in general. And I think a lot of those misconceptions come about because the public at large is probably not all that aware of what MMA actually is and what it actually takes to be an MMA fighter. So my goal today is to familiarize you all with MMA, hopefully leave you with a positive view, and at the very least, hopefully you guys will have respect for those that participate, male or female. So what is MMA? MMA stands for Mixed Martial Arts, and for a fighter, it's a sport where a competitor uses several different forms of martial arts to obtain a strategic or tactical advantage over their opponent. As an MMA fighter, my goal is to be as well-rounded as possible because MMA encompasses any and theoretically all of the martial arts. The possibilities for where a fight may go are limitless, so you've really got to try to cover all your bases. I personally have 4 separate disciplines that I focus on. I got my start, as Dave said, in Muay Thai kickboxing. I learned how to kick, punch, knee, elbow, and it really instilled just the love in me for hand-to-hand combat. I've also trained and competed in boxing. It's been a lot more complicated than I thought it would be. The mechanics of throwing just simply a punch are intense, and from boxing I learned obviously how to punch and maybe not so obviously footwork. Next is wrestling. Wrestling was a sport that didn't used to see a lot of female fighters very good at. It's since established itself as such a cornerstone in MMA that today you're not going to find a successful MMA fighter that isn't well versed in wrestling. And last but certainly not least, my personal favorite is Jiu Jitsu or grappling. As Dave said, it consists of mainly ground fighting or grappling, and you use submissions and joint locks. And the great thing about Jiu Jitsu is one of its most basic premises is that a smaller, weaker person can defeat a much larger, stronger opponent with the use of leverage and technique. In 2008, I competed in the South Carolina State Grappling Championships, and I won by submitting a girl that weighed 175 pounds. At that time, she was a full 60 pounds bigger than me. And in 2009, I competed in the same tournament, and I won, this time by submitting a girl that was 200 pounds. She was a full 90 pounds bigger than me at that time. And while that may sound exceptional in Jiu Jitsu, it's really not. MMA became more mainstream in 1993 when the Ultimate Fighting Championships, or the UFC, premiered on pay-per-view. That show sold 86,000 pay-per-view buys, and by the 3rd show, that number was up to 300,000. And today, it's not uncommon for a UFC show to sell 1.6 million pay-per-view buys. So obviously, the popularity has grown exponentially. Thankfully, women's MMA is not that far behind. This is a picture of Gina Carano. She single-handedly smashed one of the most common misconceptions in women's MMA, and that is that in order to be a successful fighter, you need to look like a man. It's just not true. She's been dubbed the face of women's MMA, and she's kind of my hero. Another misconception of MMA is that it's this overly dangerous sport with this extremely high rate of injury. Since 2001, MMA got revamped, restructured, and a lot of safeguards and regulations got put into place. It truly is structured around the safety of the fighter. Before any fight, I get told by the referee that I need to avoid getting in any kind of bad situation, because especially as an amateur fighter, the referee is going to stop the fight as soon as he sees another fighter or one of the fighters no longer defending themselves properly. A lot of people seem to have this idea that an MMA fight isn't over until one of the fighters is unconscious and bleeding on the ground, and it's just not true. I was also a competitive gymnast in the past and a competitive surfer, and I'm telling you, I got hurt more often in surfing and way more in gymnastics than I ever have in MMA. Now, again, I was telling you, most people think that MMA fights aren't over until someone's bleeding and unconscious on the ground. The knockout, or KO, is actually one of the least likely ways for a fight to end. A fight's much more likely to end by a technical knockout, or TKO, and that's where a referee steps in and ends the fight. I've been in 5 MMA matches, and in 4 of those matches, I exited the cage in the exact same shape as I entered. That may not always happen, but it's still not as overly dangerous as some people seem to think. I hope to garner a little bit of respect from you all by letting you all in on just a little bit of what it takes to be an MMA fighter. As a spectator, all you see is the fighters show up, enter the ring, and face their opponent. And you probably think, wow, that's got to be so challenging, so difficult. You're fighting in front of thousands of people. The truth is, the fight is the easy part. The hard part is getting ready. I personally spend about 15 hours in the MMA gym just doing MMA. And that doesn't include the 3 to 4 hours I spend lifting weights, and the 3 to 4 hours I spend running sprints or pulling sled or doing other explosive type work like that. I also have to add that I work over 40 hours a week, and the commute between my home, work, and where I train is almost 2 hours. I also threw in there that I also own 2 Jack Russell Terriers, so I'm obviously a really, really busy girl. I hope to go pro next year, and those numbers will more than double, if I'm lucky enough to have the time. Another really common misconception about MMA is that it promotes violence, and I just have to disagree. The main thing I think MMA promotes is respect. Respect for your teacher or sensei, that person or persons that are bestowing all of this knowledge on you. And also, I have so much respect for my fellow fighters and any and every opponent I've ever faced, because I know what it takes to get there and to do this. It also promotes humility. There is no greater damage taken than the damage taken to an overinflated ego. And with fighting, especially with MMA, anything can happen. It really doesn't matter how talented you are. A fight can change in a split second, so you have to always be humble. And as I've kind of touched on, it also promotes dedication, self-defense, physical fitness, and also nutritional awareness. Now, I'd like to kind of wrap up with, or by paraphrasing a quote. This was made by a professional MMA fighter, Jason Mayhem Miller. And he was, like I am, appealing to some of the naysayers out there to take a closer look at MMA before you write it off as this barbaric, savage, or brutal sport. And he said, "The simplicity of our sport is also its beauty. The rules are so basic and unrestricted that they lend themselves to some of the most beautiful exchanges and heart-wrenching stories that could take place over the course of a few 5-minute rounds. And once you learn what's really going on in the cage, the barbarism turns to science, the savagery to strategy, and the brutality is simply the pureness of the sport. I didn't get into this sport to beat people up without going to jail. I got into it for the challenge. It's considered the ultimate game of chess. And if boxing is to be considered the sweet science, MMA must be considered quantum physics. Thank you.